You clicked because you have heard the name before, the Doomsday Glacier. And right now, as you are watching this, a crack is spreading across a slab of ice in West Antarctica that most Americans have never even seen on a map. Here's what I need you to hear in the next few seconds. A floating shelf of ice, roughly the size of Florida, is being held in place by a single underwater ridge. And the researchers who study it up close have already put a countdown on it, not decades. A window measured in a handful of years, and part of that window has already closed. I track these systems for a living, and I remember the exact moment this one stopped feeling abstract to me. It was a set of satellite radar readings showing warm seawater pushing miles under ice we were told was still frozen solid to the bedrock. That reading is from a study published in 2024, and by the end of this video, I am going to show you the exact free tool from a United States federal agency that lets you check whether your own street is inside the long-term reach of what this glacier can do. Because this is not a South Pole problem, if you live anywhere near an American coastline, this number ends up in your zip code. So let me start the clock where the scientists started it. In December of 2021, at a major gathering of Earth scientists, a glaciologist from Oregon State University named Erin Pettit stood up and said something that stopped the room. She described the Thwaites eastern ice shelf, the floating tongue of ice at the front of the glacier, as being like a car windshield with a slow crack spreading across it. And she gave it a timeline. She said that shelf could shatter within about 5 years. Do that math with me. 5 years from late 2021 lands us right now. We are standing inside the back half of the exact window she named. That is why this story just came roaring back into the headlines. That is the new debate. Not whether the ice is weakening, but whether the clock she started is about to run out on schedule. Now, let me tell you what Thwaites actually is, because the nickname does it no justice. Thwaites Glacier sits in West Antarctica. On its own, the ice in that single glacier holds enough water to raise global sea level by about 2 feet. But that is not the number that keeps glaciologists up at night. Thwaites acts like a cork in a bottle. It sits in front of the much larger West Antarctic ice sheet, holding it back. Pull the cork, and scientists estimate the water eventually released could raise global sea level by around 10 feet. 10 feet. That is not a beach erosion problem. That rewrites the map of every coastal city in America. And here is the part that tightened my chest the first time I read it. The floating ice shelf, the windshield with the crack in it, is currently pinned in place by an underwater mountain, a ridge on the seafloor that the ice is snagged against. That single pinning point is doing a huge share of the work of holding the front of the glacier steady. When Pettit's team looked at the fractures spreading across that shelf, they saw the ice slowly losing its grip on that ridge. And once a floating shelf like that lets go and breaks apart, the glacier behind it speeds up, it flows faster into the sea, the cork loosens. So that is the setup, a slab the size of my home state, hanging on by one snag with a crack running across it and a timer that started ticking in 2021. But a crack on the surface was never the whole story, because while everyone was watching the top of the ice, the real damage was happening in the dark, hundreds of feet underneath it. And that is where the numbers stop being scary and start being genuinely alarming. Here is the question that reorganized how I watch this glacier. What if the ice you think is safely grounded, frozen down onto solid rock, is already being eaten from below by water you cannot see? In May of 2024, a team led by Eric Rignot, a glaciologist at the University of California, Irvine, published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. They used high-resolution radar data from a satellite system to look at what was happening at the grounding line of Thwaites. The grounding line is the boundary. It is the point where the glacier stops resting on bedrock and starts floating out over the ocean. For decades, we treated that line like a wall. On one side, solid grounded ice. On the other, floating ice. What Rignot's team found erased that wall. They discovered that warm, salty seawater is being pumped underneath the grounded ice, sliding inland for miles beyond the line we thought marked the edge of the ocean's reach. And it is the tide doing it. Twice a day, the tide rises and lifts the ice just slightly, and that pumping action drives seawater in along the base of the glacier, then pulls back, then pushes in again. Over and over, the water Rignot's team tracked was not near freezing. It was warm enough, a couple of degrees above the freezing point, to melt ice aggressively. And in the ocean, a couple of degrees above freezing at that depth is a blowtorch. Think about what that means for the timeline. Every melt model we had assumed the grounded part of the glacier was protected, that the sea could only nibble at the floating edge. This study says the sea is already reaching miles inland, underneath, where we cannot easily see it, thinning the ice from the bottom up. That is why so many of the older projections now look too slow. They were built on a map that no longer matches the water. So the crack on top, the one Pettit gave 5 years to, is not the only clock running. There is a second, quieter clock underneath, and it is melting the anchor. The whole thing depends on. Now, I want to be honest with you, because this is where the debate the title mentions actually lives. Some scientists look at this and say the full collapse could still take a century or longer to fully play out. Others look at the same seawater intrusion data and say we are underestimating the speed that the grounding line could retreat far faster than the models predict once this process takes hold. That disagreement is real, and I am not going to pretend it away. But here is what almost nobody in that debate disputes, and this is the part that should hold your attention. The direction is one way. The glacier is losing. The only argument is about how many years we have, not whether the ice is going. And when the range of expert opinion runs from a few decades to a couple of centuries, that is not comfort. That is the difference between this being your grandchildren's problem and this being yours. Therefore, the next question I had to answer was the one you are probably forming right now. How do we even know what is happening underneath a glacier the size of Florida, buried under ice at the bottom of the world? Because if the measurements are shaky, the timeline is a guess. And what I found out about how they got these readings is exactly what convinced me this is not guesswork. Let me take you underneath the ice, because this is the part that turned my skepticism into concern. In 2019 and 2020, a team drilled a hole straight through more than 1/3 of a mile of ice near the Thwaites grounding line and lowered a torpedo-shaped robot into the water beneath it. The robot is called IceFin. The scientist who led that work is Brittany Schmidt, now at Cornell University. And the results were published in the journal Nature in February of 2023. For the first time, we had eyes in the exact place the models could only estimate. And what IceFin found was strange, and it matters. Across the flat underside of the ice, the melting was actually slower than some feared. But that was not the story. The story was in the cracks and the staircases. Wherever the ice had fractures or formed those step-like terraces along its base, the melt rate shot up. Warm water got into the crevices, swirled, and carved them wider and deeper. In other words, the ice is not melting evenly like a block on a counter. It is melting where it is already weak, attacking the fractures, prying open the exact flaws that hold the structure together. Now connect that to the grounding line, which is the number I keep coming back to. Since the late 1990s, the grounding line of Thwaites has retreated inland by miles. As it pulls back, it moves into deeper water. And deeper water means more of that warm current can get underneath, which melts more ice, which floats the grounding line back even further. It feeds itself. Scientists call that kind of self-reinforcing retreat marine ice sheet instability. In plain words, once it really gets going, it does not need anything new to keep going. It pulls its own trigger. So now you have 3 clocks running at once. The surface crack on the shelf, the tidal seawater melting the base miles inland, and the grounding line retreating into deeper and deeper water where the process accelerates itself. 3 clocks, all counting down, all pointed the same direction. And here is where I felt the floor drop out a little. Thwaites is not even the only glacier doing this. Right next door sits Pine Island Glacier, moving through the same warm water, showing the same behavior. Together, that whole sector of West Antarctica is already responsible for a meaningful and rising share of global sea level rise. Thwaites alone is estimated to contribute roughly 4% of the annual global rise on its own from just one glacier. And that share has been climbing. But I know what a lot of you are thinking right now, because I read your comments on videos like this every single week. You are thinking, that is Antarctica. That is the ocean. I live 200 miles from the coast on high ground. This is a sad documentary, not my emergency. So this next part is specifically for you, the ones who assume the water stops before it reaches you. Stay with me, because this is the piece that puts your address on the map. Here is the thing about sea level rise from a glacier like this, that the word rise hides from you. It does not arrive like a slow, even bathtub filling 1 inch at a time everywhere. It arrives through storms. It arrives through high tides that used to be harmless and now push water into streets that never flooded. It arrives through storm surge, riding in on top of a baseline that is already higher than it was when your house was built. Every extra foot of base ocean height means a hurricane's surge starts from a higher launch pad and reaches farther inland than the same storm would have reached a generation ago. So even if you are inland, ask yourself the real questions. Where does your drinking water come from, and is that supply anywhere near a coastal aquifer that salt water can push into? Where does your food get shipped through? A huge share of American goods move through coastal ports, and those ports flooding is a national supply problem, not a local one. Who in your family lives closer to the water than you do? And are you the person they would call? And what happens to property values, insurance rates, and tax bases across an entire region when the coast starts retreating and millions of people need somewhere new to live? That pressure does not stay at the beach. It moves inland. It moves toward you. Here is the one concrete thing I want you to do today, no matter where you live. And I am going to give you the exact tool for it before this video ends. I want you to look up your own elevation and your own long-term flood exposure using real federal data, not a real estate listing, not a rumor, the actual mapped projection. Because the difference between people who handle a slow-moving disaster and people who get crushed by it is almost never money. It is time. It is who saw the number early and who found out the hard way. And that word early is exactly where this story gets uncomfortable. Because now that you understand the science, I have to tell you about the gap between what the data says and what you have been told. If you want to go deeper than any single video can take you, I have written 3 books that go further into exactly this territory. Storm Ready, Storm Signal, and Storm Protocol each cover a different layer of how these slow-moving systems eventually become fast-moving crises, and what the people who prepared early actually did differently. You can find them linked in the description below. I wrote them because the gap between the data and what reaches most people is too wide to close in 15 minutes. And some of you are ready for the full read. Because the difference between people who handle a slow-moving disaster and people who get crushed by it is almost never money. It is time. It is who saw the number early and who found out the hard way. I held this part until now on purpose, because I did not want it to sound like anger before you understood the readings. But now you understand the readings, so let me be straight with you. The official language around Thwaites is consistently softer than the measurements underneath it. Watch how it gets worded in the calm coverage. Sea level rise is described as something happening by the year 2100, a number so far out it lands like a fairy tale. The word used is contribute, as in the glacier will contribute to rise, which sounds gentle, gradual, manageable. The collapse is described as a process, and process makes people picture something slow and orderly. But the scientists standing on the ice used different words. Erin Pettit did not say process. She said shatter, like a windshield, within about 5 years. Eric Rignaut's team did not say gradual. They documented vigorous melting from seawater that had already invaded miles farther than the maps allowed. There is a distance between shatter and contribute, and you are living inside that distance. Now, I am not going to tell you anyone is hiding this in a vault. The studies are public. The names are real. You can read them, but there is a reason the softened version is the one that reaches your dinner table, and it is worth saying plainly. Nobody in an official position gets rewarded for scaring you with a timeline they cannot prove to the exact year. Hedging is safe. Saying by 2100 is safe because nobody watching will remember to check. Saying within 5 years is a risk, and institutions do not like risk. So the caution built into official language is not a lie. It is just a filter, and that filter always strains out the urgency before the message reaches you. Who benefits from you staying calm? Think about it honestly. Coastal property is worth trillions of dollars. There are entire markets, entire tax bases, entire industries whose value depends on people not internalizing what a 10-foot ceiling on sea level rise would eventually mean. A calm public keeps buying, keeps building, keeps insuring at the beach. The incentive to keep the number quiet and distant is enormous, and it does not require a conspiracy. It just requires everyone to prefer the comfortable version. And they do. That is why I do this. I got caught flat once by a system I told myself was still days away, and it was not, and I promised myself I would never again wait for permission to take a reading seriously. So I read the studies instead of the headlines, and I bring you the words the scientists actually used, not the ones the press release smoothed over. Therefore, the only responsible thing left is to give you the readout that lets you act today in the next 10 minutes from your own home. And this is the part I promised you at the very beginning. This is the finale. Here is what almost nobody watching the news about the Doomsday Glacier has been told they can do. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, the same federal agency that runs the hurricane and ocean monitoring this country depends on, publishes a free public tool called the Sea Level Rise Viewer. It is run through their Office for Coastal Management. You can open it right now on your phone. You type in your city or your address, and you move a slider from 1 foot of rise up through 10 feet, the exact ceiling scientists tie to a West Antarctic collapse, and the map shows you, in blue, precisely what goes underwater at each level. Not a guess. Not a real estate estimate. Actual elevation data mapped by the federal government, the same data emergency planners use. Let me tell you why this is the number that changes everything, because it did for me. When I first heard 10 feet of sea level rise, my brain filed it as a distant abstraction. Then I put my own region into that viewer and moved the slider to 3 feet and watched roads I drive disappear under blue. Not at 10 feet, at 3. And 3 feet is inside the range. Multiple studies now consider plausible this century if the West Antarctic sector goes the way the seawater intrusion data suggests it could. That was the moment the glacier stopped being a documentary and became a countdown I could see on my own street. Here is the hero's turn in all of this, the part I want you to hold on to. The signal was always there in the data. The radar saw the warm water pushing inland. The robot saw the melting in the cracks. The satellites tracked the grounding line marching backward mile by mile. The scientists read it correctly and said the hard words out loud. Shatter, vigorous, within 5 years. The only thing that failed was the distance between their reading and your ears. And you just close that distance. You now have the same picture the planners have, and you have it while there is still time to use it, which is the entire difference between preparing and reacting. So this is exactly what I need you to do in order. First, Open that NOAA Sea Level Rise viewer and find your own location. And do not stop at 1 foot, push the slider up through the range and watch what changes. Second, check the elevation of the people you are responsible for. The parents near the water, the kids in a coastal college town, anyone who would call you when it floods. Third, if you own coastal or near coastal property, understand that flood insurance, elevation certificates, and the long-term direction of this data are now part of protecting what you have, not paperwork you can put off. None of that requires panic. All of it requires that you saw the number early. And you just did. Because here is where the two clocks finally meet. The one on the ice, ticking down through the window Aaron Pettit named back in 2021, and the one in your own life. The years you have to make a plan before the water rewrites the choice for you. The whole point of watching this developing story is not to feel afraid. It is to trade fear for time. And time is the one thing the news, with its comfortable year 2100, was quietly taking from you. You made it to the end, which tells me exactly who you are. You are not the kind of person who wants the softened headline. You want the real reading and the real timeline, even when it is heavier, because you would rather carry the truth early than get handed the surprise late. That is the whole reason this channel exists, for people who would rather know. So let me leave you with the number that matters, and I want you to answer it. Open that NOAA viewer, move the slider to 3 feet, and tell me in the comments what happened to your street, your town, your region. Does the blue reach you at 3 feet? At 6? Does it not reach you until 10? Tell me the level, and tell me what region you are watching from. Your state, your coast, your town. Because I read these and I want to see where the exposure clusters. Say it out loud in that comment box, because the people who write it down are the people who remember to act on it. And if you want the next reading before the crowd gets it, subscribe and stay close, because this is not the only clock I am tracking. I am already watching the grounding line data on Pine Island Glacier, the one sitting right next to Thwaites, moving through the same warm water, showing the same signs, and there is a number coming out of that sector that I think reorders the entire timeline you just heard. I will bring it to you the moment it firms up. The people who get the alert early are the ones already here. Be one of them. The ice has been counting down since 2021. Now you are counting with it. And unlike almost everyone else, you started early enough for it to matter. If you stayed with me this far, there's more I want to show you. Inside the Weather Watch, I pick up right where I stopped and walk you through the warm seawater intrusion under the grounding line, the part happening in the dark. In there, you can ask me your own question, and a real person, me, answers you myself. You won't be doing this alone. Just point your phone's camera at the code on the screen, cancel anytime, no risk.